really matters towards the development of history is what happens at home. What changes domestically, socially, politically, culturally. During a war, that is a far bigger story than who won the Battle of blank or who did the invasion of whatever. So today we're going to spend a lot of time on the pre-war foreign policy, how we end up getting sucked into World War II. Hopefully you'll identify the parallels between pre-World War I and pre-World War II foreign policy as we get stuck in kind of a similar situation. And then we'll talk about this mobilization of a war economy. This mobilization, how we create an economy to fit the needs of the war. And that's a big, 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 big turning point in American policy for the entire 20th century. It is what ends the Great Depression. It is what kickstarts the Civil Rights Movement. It is what wins the war for quote-unquote democracy. The American war economy is arguably the most important thing to come out of this part of the 20th century. So your Collegeboard Framework is here. I don't normally spend any time going over the actual wording of it, but for today I will. So big picture, it is mass mobilization. Mass mobilization of the economy, of society, of culture, of everything. It really is the first total war for America since the Civil War. A war in which politics are wrapped up in the war, the economy is wrapped up in the war, society is wrapped up in the war, American culture is wrapped up in the war, everything is wrapped up in the war, and it is that helps end the Great Depression. Right? The New Deal does its job. The New Deal makes the Depression tolerable. The New Deal gets people back to work. The New Deal does things. You could just leave it flat, like iPads are supposed to work, you know? Instead of trying to jerry-rig some fancy thing out over there. But it's the World War II's industrial base that ends the Great Depression, and it's U.S. industrialism that wins the war. Talk about that today. Second, and this piece is arguably more important, what happens at home during every war? What happens? We've talked about this throughout. What happens during war, domestically speaking?
Like higher wages.
Potentially, there's a chance for higher wages. What else? Progress sometimes. What else happens during war? Produce more. What happens to civil liberties during a war? We restrict civil liberties during every war. Give me some examples. Habeas corpus, Lincoln, Civil War. Good.
With Japan.
Espionage and Sedition Acts, World War I, right? We put Eugene Debs in jail. U.S. versus Debs. Supreme Court said it's cool. Put people in jail. U.S. versus Sheikh, same thing. Even as far back as the Alien and Sedition Acts during the French Revolution under Adams' presidency. So every single time we have a war, civil liberties are restricted, are a little bit taken away. Or for some, the Japanese, a lot taken away. So the thing that we need to point out, though, is that while some lose their civil liberties during wartime, to Luis's point, to Josue's point, World War II gives an awesome platform for other marginalized groups to fill a void. And when other marginalized groups fill a void, they want more. Always. This has been a theme for the entire APUSH year. When you give somebody a little bit of freedom, what do they want next? Always. So we see African Americans, we see women. Those are the two big groups during World War II, but to a smaller extent, we see Mexican American and Native American workers filling a bigger void during the war, which is going to launch some movements that are going to ask for their progress afterwards. Big deal. Your prompt is here. I'll say it first, please.
Evaluate the extent to which the Homefront experience during World War II expanded the freedom and opportunities available to Americans.
Good. So we're going to talk about, we're going to expand some opportunities, but we're going to restrict some freedoms. That's a big takeaway for today. That yes, we have the progress of African Americans working, but we restrict purchasing power with rationing, for example. Right? So a lot of different stuff there. So I'm actually going to take a step back into the 1920s to kind of sow these roots of how we got here. So what does America do after, or not do after World War I? What does America do or not do coming out of World War I?
Keep ourselves isolated.
Okay, good. That's the theme, but give me a much more specific action. What ends World War I?
Treaty of Paris.
Treaty of Versailles.
Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles. You're okay. It's the Treaty of Paris. That's basically every other war. The Treaty of Versailles. And what does the U.S. do with the Treaty of Versailles?
We try to raise some points.
It creates the League of Nations. Yeah, the German guilt clause, German reparation, absolutely. Does the U.S. ratify the Treaty of Versailles? No. So we don't ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and therefore we don't join the League of Nations. So I heard, Luis, what do we do?
14 points.
That's back up here. What does the U.S. actually do, though?
Keep ourselves isolated.
Back to isolationism. Warren G. Harding's approach was called the return to what? Normalcy, right? He's making up words and whatnot. This return to normalcy, which I still argue is not a real word, but if it is, good for you. Make up words. George W. Bush did it for his whole presidency. Return to normalcy. And that wasn't just foreign policy-wise. This is a foreign policy. But that was a domestic policy thing as well. Forget what we used to do with the progressive era. Let's go back to pro-business, back to isolationism, back to the way things used to be. Normalcy. Well, it's always been normal in American history. So for the most part, this is our scope and our sequence post-World War I. With a couple small examples. The U.S. does, in the 1920s, try to play a role in avoiding future conflicts without actually engaging in the League of Nations, which sucks. First, we engage in the Washington Naval Conference, or the Washington Disarmament Conference, which takes place in 1921, in which 5 of the big powers in the world sign a treaty. It's called the Five-Power Treaty. Again, APUSH stays winning on the names of things that are pretty accurate. The U.S., Great Britain, Japan, France, and Italy come together and sign this Five-Power Treaty, in which all 5 promise to disarm themselves at a specific ratio. Now, you're never going to have to know the ratio, I promise, because that's dumb. Put it in a table. But the U.S. gets a ratio of 5-1, Great Britain at 5-1, Japan at 3-1, and then France and Italy at 1.75 to 1. In terms of like how much military they can keep. In this attempt for international disarmament, international reduction of arms. So who kind of gets screwed in this situation? Talk to me. France, Italy, who else? And Japan. And this is going to piss Japan off because Japan wants to think of themselves as one of the big players in the world. They do. They're like that little 12-year-old at Thanksgiving that wants to sit at the adult table. Right? Or today. Yeah, right? Maybe some of you guys still have to sit at the kids' table at your family holiday gatherings. I don't know. It's easy for mine too. But Japan thinks of themselves coming out of World War I like a world power, and they feel slighted. They feel insulted that they're being lumped with these lesser quote-unquote powers. So this, again, it's an attempt to rectify the problems that got us into World War I by disarming nations internationally. Also, 1928, this is one of my favorite things in world history, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Who remembers this from world history last year? Cool. Excellent. In which dozens of nations in the world come together to sign an agreement. And their agreement basically just says that war is not the answer. that they're signing a pledge that war is not a tool of foreign policy. Who thinks that's kind of a nice idea? We should not use war to further our foreign policies. That's a pretty good idea. Why is that a stupid treaty? Or a stupid pact? It does nothing. Why not, Chavez?
They just agree to it, but they don't like taking any laws or acts.
Okay, how are you going to enforce it? Who's going to enforce that?
The League of Nations.
The League of Nations, maybe, but the League of Nations is such a paper tiger that nobody really thinks. So, for example, if Josue and Cortez make an agreement that says fighting is not the answer, right? And then Eliam comes and socks Josue, what's Josue going to do? He's going to fight back. Right? Or at first he's going to cry a little bit, because Eliam's very strong. Yeah. And then he's going to fight back, right? And then what's Cortez going to do? Nothing. So the idea with this is, though, it's just words. It's just words. And words are not really enforceable if you're not going to enforce them. So that's our disarmament. And we're trying to make the world a safer place, but it is what it is. On economics as well, we are going back to a more isolationist perspective. right? In the 1920s, we begin, as you guys ideally talked about in your context of your DBQ, that we talked about last week. We're going back to a pro-business, pro-isolationism perspective by increasing tariffs from 1922 all the way to 1930 with the Hawley-Smoot tariff, the biggest tariff in American history, which is supposed to fix the Great Depression and just made it worse. Also of note, though, I talked about this Thursday after school, is the Dawes Plan. One of my personal favorites in American history. As we look at the economic world post-World War I, who got screwed in World War I economically speaking? All right, so Germany gets screwed. Who do they owe money to? Great. We'll call it Britain and France for the most part. Yes? And then who do Britain and France owe money to? Yeah, they owe money to us for all that, all the lending, all the pre-World War I, as we're just shipping them whatever they need. So yeah, they owe us a bunch of money too. Can Germany pay Britain and France?
No.
No. And then therefore Britain and France can't pay us, and then we're all sorts of screwed. So this brilliant Dawes Plan, my favorite, says the U.S. is going to loan money. We're going to loan. Okay, now we're loaning more money out. It can be worrisome. But at this point in America, everybody's borrowing money, so who cares? We're going to loan money to Germany. Germany's going to take that money and pay what they owe to Britain and France, and then Britain and France can pay back the loans they took from the U.S. What, Luis? We're just paying ourselves. Right? Like if I owe Eliam money, and Eliam owes Hector money, and Hector loans me money to pay Eliam, and then Eliam pays Hector, and then... So this Dawes Plan is great, but then once one economy collapses, we can't loan money to Germany anymore, so they can't pay Britain and France, they collapse. Now they can't buy stuff from us anymore, so ours gets worse. So this time of economic isolation is also going to cause us some trouble. So why don't these efforts work? Why do we not avoid a World War II? Because we failed to introduce the idea of human nature and the Great Depression. Right? The Great Depression makes all of these plans go out the window, as every country in the world is looking out for themselves. Every country in the world is, to at least a moderate extent, desperate. And desperate countries, desperate people do desperate things. And desperation can give you somebody like a Hitler. That's why the New Deal is successful. Because it at least makes things tolerable enough that the U.S. doesn't descend into totalitarianism. I know. I see you thinking about it. Oh, I should put that in the DBQ. The New Deal makes it so that people realize their government's doing their best, so they don't resort to picking somebody who's much more extreme. It's an important point. Whereas in Germany, in Japan, in Italy, and elsewhere, that doesn't happen. So what's happening in these three important nations is totalitarianism and expansionism. Who do we often blame for starting World War II? Germany, right? I'll make a compelling argument that what Japan does in World War II, A, starts way before Germany does, and B, is arguably, I'm not saying fully, arguably just as bad, if not worse, in terms of human rights violations. Now, Germany gets obviously all the blame, because Germany perpetuates the Holocaust. That's bad, right? And it's bad because it involves one nation systemically trying to eliminate an entire people. That's bad. What Japan does, though, with human rights violations in China, in Manchuria, is awful. Rape on a massively systemic level that we've never seen militarily before. Absolute atrocities against the civilians of China. So what Japan is doing is really, really, really bad. But after the war, we're like, well, at least they didn't do the Holocaust. So Japan kind of comes off easy in this situation. Japan invades Manchuria, which is right here on the eastern shore between the Soviet Union and China, in 1931. 10 years before Pearl Harbor, Japan is expanding themselves. Japan invades mainland China in 1937. So Japan is working to pursue an expansionist, totalitarian domination foreign policy What Japan fancies themselves as is the Nazi Germany of the Pacific. They want to control the entire Pacific world. They want to control Japan, China, the Eastern Soviet Union, the Eurasian mainland, Indochina. Japan is trying to run the world in their side of the world. Italy invades Ethiopia in northern Africa in 1935. So before Germany has done anything, the two powers that become Germany's allies have already expanded into new land. Now, I believe firmly that what Germany's doing is waiting and watching. What are they watching for?
Opportunities.
What is Germany watching for? Nobody cares about the U.S. necessarily. Yeah, how Europe's going to respond. To see, like, is there going to be a strong response? Are they going to just let this happen? And Europe's response is one of appeasement. If you appease a bully, what is a bully going to do? Yeah, right? If I come and I take Eliam's lunch money. Bitch, give me your lunch money. He's like, dumbass, when should I bring my own lunch? I don't got no money. Yes, it's always delicious. It's all good. So, but if I take Eliam's lunch money, and Josue is like, hey, Winch, don't do that. And I take his lunch money anyway, and Josue is like, man, you shouldn't have done that. What happens next time I take Eliam's lunch money? I'm going to keep doing it. Right? So what Europe does is the James Buchanan. What Europe does is the James Buchanan of policies, where it's like, hey, man, why you got to take Ethiopia like that? That's messed up. You shouldn't do that. And Italy's like, cool. Good story. Takes Ethiopia. And then Germany goes and remilitarizes and invades the Rhineland, land taken from them in World War I. And we're like, hey, bro, you shouldn't do that. That's messed up. That's not nice. And exactly. And then Japan goes and invades China, and we're like, man, that's really messed up how you guys invaded China. You should not do that. And Japan's like, cool story. So what happens is, as these nations are expanding and the League of Nations does nothing to stop them, not that they could have anyway. The League of Nations has no real forces of note, no budget of note. It doesn't matter, because by the time this thing blows up, it's too late anyway. By 1938, Germany has invaded the Sudetenland, more land than they say is rightfully theirs, because it was taken from them in World War I, and these are German-speaking people, and they should be united under this new proud flag of Germany. We finally call a conference, the Munich Conference. Very famous. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, famously goes, and he's like, oh yeah, I convinced Hitler to stop expanding. We're good to go. He comes back from this Munich Conference, and he says very famously to the British press, we have achieved peace in our time. We have achieved peace in our time. And Hitler's like, that idiot. All I had to do was tell him I was done expanding, and he left me alone. Right? This is very much like Hoover taking office and saying, we are so close to ending poverty, we're almost there. Boom, never mind. So shortly after Munich, after we think we've achieved peace in our time, everything goes to hell. The Soviets and the Nazis, the two biggest military powers in Europe, agree to not fight each other. And then Hitler turns right around at the end of 1939 and invades Poland. Poland falls faster than France, which says something, because Poland is a neutral nation with very, very little military power, and World War II has begun 1 year after Neville Chamberlain promised that we've achieved peace in our time. He's like the Herbert Hoover of Great Britain. Nicely done. I did it, guys. I got Hitler to agree to stop expanding. Hitler's like, you did? Nobody told me. So while all this is happening, the U.S. is much more focused on foreign policies on our side of the world. We are very much Monroe doctoring this problem. We're like, hey, that's Europe. That's their problem. That's their issue. We're over here minding our business in our Western Hemisphere. Sure enough, FDR pursues what's called the good neighbor policy, which is kind of like, hey, all you Latin American and Hispanic American nations, I know we've been really mean to you of late. What have we done to them every time there's a problem?
Taking their land.
Yeah.
Taking their land, but more recently. We haven't taken land in a while.
Texas.
That Texas is a long time ago. That's 100 years ago. What have we done every time there's a problem in Latin America? We intervene. How do we intervene? Militarily, right? Ever since Teddy and big stick diplomacy, every time Mexico has a problem, Guatemala has a problem, Nicaragua has a problem, Panama has a problem, we send the military and we let the military solve our problems big stick diplomacy-wise. Under the good neighbor policy, we instead say, hey, Latin America, we're going to be a better neighbor. Sorry that every time things, act up, we send our, forces to kind of mess up your whole country. But going forward, we're going to treat you guys like equals. We're going to, instead of just sending forces and telling you what to do, whether militarily, morally, or economically, we will negotiate with you as if we're equals. So we backed that up with a couple of important conferences, the Pan-American conferences of 1933 and 1936, in which we engage in real discussions with Latin American nations as if they are on equal footing with the United States. That's progress. Herbert Hoover first coined this term, the good neighbor policy, but as soon as something went wrong in Mexico, he sent the army. So he didn't exactly back it up. The bonus army all over again. Also, we are trying to negotiate reciprocal trade agreements, lowering of tariffs, lowering of barriers to free trade, trying to build relationships with other countries that aren't built on me winning at your expense, but having good economic relationships. These come in response, post, Holly Smoot tariff. If you guys remember that from Hoover's presidency, the highest tariff of all time in American history, which was supposed to be Hoover's response to fixing the Great Depression. In fact, it just makes it worse. Because we put a massive tariff on other countries so that Americans will buy what? Yeah, American. Good. Whereas then 33 other countries do the same thing to us. So then we can't sell our goods overseas and it just makes things worse. And Hoover's like, I tried something. We're just locked in the cup. Yes, I enjoy this cartoon very much. Of course, we have FDR negotiating with a man in a sombrero. And somebody looks like an Indian princess. But you can't win them all, America. Cannot win them all. So, throughout this, though, we're just more worried about the economics of our country than we are what's happening in Europe. We have other big problems to deal with in the Great Depression, economically speaking. We are too preoccupied with the Great Depression to actually address what's happening in Europe. Do FDR and Congress know what's happening in Europe? Yes. Do we care? No. Yeah. Are we going to do anything about it? Absolutely not. So as we see Hitler, there's a really, really good documentary right now about, it just came out, it was nominated for Best Documentary Short. The name of it is slipping, I'll tell you about it in class. But it's about one of the first ever Nazi rallies in America. Right, in Madison Square Garden, and you guys are basketball fans with the Knicks play, right, where there's tens of thousands of people who are like, yeah, Nazism in America. And it's crazy, right? So we're just more worried about keeping things stable enough at home that things don't fully fall apart. As Europe and Asia fall into more problems, what happens instead of us getting excited about getting involved in the war or believing that we should get involved in the war is it strengthens our isolationism. This is important. As we see Hitler expanding and getting a little wild, as we see Italy expanding and getting a little wild, we're like, see? We told you we shouldn't join the League of Nations. Because there goes Europe doing European things again. And if we joined the League of Nations, we'd have to get involved, and it's not our problem. So if anything, the rising threats in Europe and Asia only strengthen our belief as a country that we did the right thing not getting involved in their problems. We did the right thing not getting involved in their problems. Now, a lot of this is driven by an important name for today. His name is Gerald Nye. Gerald Nye, N-Y-E. He's a senator from North Dakota, which, how many senators do each state get? 2. Yeah, so being a senator from North Dakota in 1934 is not a very big accomplishment. There's like 16 people in North Dakota, so you have like a 1 in 8 chance of being the senator. So, he's a senator from North Dakota, and he's running what are called the Nye Committees. They're named after him, the Nye Committees. And he's trying to learn some lessons from World War I, some valuable lessons. And he looks back with his committee, they do a bunch of research on World War I, and they make an argument that it wasn't that we had any moral obligation to get involved in World War I. Instead, American big business had loaned so much money and so much material and so much resources to England and France that we had to get involved. Otherwise, we would have been screwed economically. How compelling of an argument is that? Yeah, it's a reasonable, compelling argument. But his argument, though, is that these big businesses are merchants of death. These big businesses only want war so they can profit from it. Obviously, World War I is way more complicated than that. It takes a very superficial look at it. There's way more details, right? The Zimmerman telegram and the sinking of the Lusitania. There's more to it than just business, but business does play a pretty big role in the argument. And he says, and his whole committee in Congress says that we should do everything we can to avoid that. How are we going to avoid the problems that got us into World War I? Yeah, by not trading with anybody. By keeping ourselves economically isolated, socially isolated, politically isolated. Just mind our own damn business. Saying these mistakes made it so that we had to get into World War I, or instead, we should be able to make our own decisions that are being forced into things that we don't want to do. As a result, Congress passes 3 pretty important Neutrality Acts in the 1930s that are aimed to keep us out of future wars. Neutrality Act 1 is passed in 1935. This is a very aggressive Neutrality Act. It says, our country will not sell any military resource, any weapon, any bullet, any arms, any cannon, anything. We won't sell you a damn thing if it can be used for war and you are a nation at war. I don't care if it's England, our best friend. I don't care if it's France, our second best friend who's kind of like a stepson we never wanted. I don't care who it is. We're not going to trade you or sell you anything if you were at war, and this is an act of war. Because us sending you a weapon could be construed as us supporting your war effort. Reasonable. 1 year later, they take it a step further, and they say, we won't just not sell weapons to these countries, we won't even loan money to these countries. Because, like in World War I, we don't want to have too much money invested on one side, not the other, that we need that side to win in order to get our money back. So Act 1, no weapons to nations at war. Act 2, 36, no loans to nations at war. And Act 3 said these two are now permanent. So instead of having to renew them every year like Congress had to do, these are permanent. We don't have to deal with that anymore. They're there for good, and it takes it a step further. Any trade at all. If we're selling Hilda's country a carrot, Hilda and her country must come to our country, pay cash, and take it back to their country themselves. So now it's not just military trade, it's all trade. If we are trading with your country, you will not be paying credit. You will not have an installment plan. You are not borrowing the money for it. You will pay for it cash up front. And you will take it back yourself on your own boats. Because all those problems got us into World War I. The unrestricted submarine warfare, the sinking of our ships, the loaning of money, all of those problems. The big thing here is we're trying to learn our lessons from World War I. What got us into the war without, in fact, really looking at the rest of the world around us. So this is a good cartoon. It's quick. Take a minute with your partner, please. Identify what is this guy trying to say? What is this perspective on the Neutrality Acts? 1 minute. Go for it. Go. Can't see that far? I mean, I can see you. I don't know if you can see me. Ms. Vargas, can you get an iPad for at least you, please? It hurts you. You're both right. 10 seconds. What is this cartoon trying to get at? You'll just take it. Yeah, we'll 3 seconds. 2 seconds. 1 second. All right. Talk to me, please. Just one is okay. Johnny, what is this trying to get at, sir?
That the Neutrality Act
Okay. Keep us out of trouble? Sure, sure. What else? You said something good.
On the list says that it's stopping America from getting into war, or Neutrality Acts.
It stops us from getting into war.
And then when I said that, it stops war from getting to us.
It's both, right? Good job, boys. It keeps us from getting involved in the war, but it keeps the war from getting involved in us. So that's what it's supposed to design, and this is mostly motivated by what's called American isolationism and these isolationists in the 1930s. These isolationists are largely in the Midwest, so this whole middle chunk of the country, Great Lakes and west of there. They're mostly rural and mostly conservative. So now that it's the 1930s, we know that the Republican Party is more sort of the party of conservatism and will be for the rest of American history. Well, I don't know about the future, but for the class. And it's this Republican Party, this conservative group, these Midwestern rural white people who are pretty anti-American involvement at all. Now they're largely motivated by that Nye Committee's findings that it's American business is at fault, and we should be avoiding these things at all costs. And they go so far as to form a group, a social club, so to speak, to really advocate, called the America First Committee. The America First Committee. Who's a recent example of somebody saying America First?
Trump.
Yeah, our president, right? Likes to pledge the idea of like, who cares what's happening in other countries? We're going to worry about ourselves. We're going to take care of our own business. America first. Now, these people want to stay out of World War II, and they want to promote isolationism across the board. But they're a pretty big deal. A lot of politicians are engaged in this America First idea. Their most famous advocate is a name that I think is worth noting. Charles, not Sumner. He doesn't want to come. Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh. Anybody sound familiar? That name? He's a celebrity. He's very famous. He's a good-looking dude. He's well-spoken. Americans like him. He's a pilot. He's the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean in a plane. So he's a big deal. He's making all kinds of speeches about America first, all kinds of speeches about avoiding World War II. He's getting very aggressively pro-isolationism. So he's the equivalent of, like, I don't know who would be a good comparison for today. A celebrity that people want to listen to on political matters. No, I don't count.
Like,
I'm okay.
maybe like
Today?
Elon Musk.
Oh, Jimmy Fallon.
Yeah, like a Jimmy Fallon. That's a good example. Yeah.
Elon Musk.
So somebody again though who is well spoken, who people listen to, and he's pushing this America First idea. So Europe is obviously getting closer and closer and closer to all-out war. FDR is pretty open in his speeches that he thinks staying isolated is a bad idea. What can FDR do about it though? Who declares war in America? Congress, right? So he can't really do a whole hell of a lot. He can say what he wants, but it doesn't do him much good. So FDR is pretty pro-intervention, and he's going to try to get the U.S. ready for war with the acknowledgement that war is probably going to come to us one way or the other. In 1937, he makes a very famous speech. It was in your reading. Some of you were confused, but you're reading a chunk of it right now anyway, called the Quarantine Speech. Trying to convince the rest of the world to do their job and quarantine these aggressors. What does it mean to quarantine something? To keep it contained. To keep it contained where it is. What do you usually do? What things do you usually try to quarantine? Animals, marine life, sure. Diseases. What's up?
Like the spreading of other countries invading other.
Kind of. The word quarantine is usually meant for like diseases and illnesses. This idea like, oh my God, like these people have this terrible disease, we don't know how to treat it. Put them in the hospital, lock them in this airtight place. If they die, they die. But at least the disease doesn't spread. And the world doesn't listen to him. The world's going to keep pursuing this idea of appeasement, but everything's going to change in 1939 as the Nazis and Soviets sign their agreement to be on the same team, and Germany invades Poland. However, FDR is able to get Congress to pledge $1 billion to expand our Navy, and he justifies it by saying, well, this is a defensive tactic. We use our Navy to keep us safe from war. So the Congress justifies that there. So go ahead and turn your page. And I'm going to have you read a short chunk of the quarantine speech. I'm going to give you 5 minutes total. And I'm going to have you read it and identify like what problems does he identify in the world, what's the current situation, and what does he want the rest of the world to do about it. So take 5, read it. Please give me 2 solid responses to those 2 questions, and then we'll talk about it as a class. 5 minutes. Go. See, do it. Stop. Why? Can I why? Oh, that was wild, bro. Tell me more. You're like Christoph. Just stay up late. You're not homo.
OT didn't.
In about 3 or so minutes. Good speech. It gets worse. Diving into. You can only go by the homework here in the stack. Let's see. Oh, nope. Definitely don't have it. What?
So you didn't have like any water in the hotel, so you just wouldn't go to the blankets and like give you an ICJA like text 7.
You should get out of the tap.
He said he woke up with congestion.
Frozen water.
He didn't have a DBQ.
2 minutes. Read and respond. I got 2. Seconds.
The hardest time giving himself much.
30 seconds, I'll let you talk. I know you want to. I need answers. I need answers. No way. Where are you at? Luis, good job. Thank you, sir. prove it.
I remember that.
Must be making it.
No, the little packages.
Oh, no.
Like,
All right, take a minute, touch your partner. Focus on what are the problems and what solutions does FDR offer. What are we going to do about it? 1 minute, go for it. Chat it out for me. Go. 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 Seconds. You can answer.
I could understand the word things people saying here because the rule for peace proposes that nations that we establish trust between each other. So I don't know what they mean.
What do you like, bro? What up?
Very little word that time. Hey, I'm still
What's up? There you are. All right. Talk to me, please, Brenda. What are the problems that FDR points out in the world? Okay. To an extent, sure. Johnny, go on that, please.
Over to the first question?
Yeah.
So what was that? It's saying that they should like stay away from war, but like even though they're not like in war, they should at least be prepared for it because it's like contagious. It could like come to them any moment. So
Good. That idea of contagious is important. That this idea of war and expansionism is contagious. It's a good word for it. Hence the idea of quarantine. Who does he want to quarantine these problems? Luis, what were you going to say? You're going to pop that up for a second.
Wants to stop invasion of weaker nations.
Okay, he wants countries to stop invading other countries. Right, to go back to like honoring the things they said. Go back to honoring their agreements, honoring their pacts. Deal peacefully and trustfully with other countries. That's important. Yes, sir.
For the first one, this is like code I put that basically saying that the whole world is at risk of getting into the war due to the violation of the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah. Eventually, the whole world's going to be at war if we continue these policies of just doing whatever we want for ourselves. So, the war begins in 1939, sort of like a world war, when Nazi Germany invades Poland. Excuse me. And Congress makes a change. In 1939, we amend these Neutrality Acts. We slightly tweak them. This is an important shift for your next question. And it allows the country to sell weapons to the Allies. Could not do that before. Agreed? As of Neutrality Act 1935, we could not sell any war materials to other countries that are at war. In 1939, we tweak that and allow any companies to sell weapons to the Allies, but it still has to be cash and carry. So we'll sell stuff to Great Britain, sell stuff to France as long as they pay cash, and they come pick it up. Right? It's like the policy of a good drug dealer. You know, don't do payment plans, right? Don't go delivering that stuff. Right? Make them come to you. Got to pay in cash, got to transport our own ships. Here's a good cartoon of Congress and FDR debating whether to amend the Neutrality Acts or not. As you can see, Europe is all on fire. And they're a little worried that these embers of war, these sparks, are now coming to, and landing in the United States. So war is becoming closer. What should we do about it? And what we do about it is this new cash and carry policy. This policy allows us to aid the Allies to pick a side, at this point just Britain and France, to aid them without actually getting involved in the war by shipping stuff ourselves or by loaning money to those that are involved. It's this policy that begins getting us out of the Great Depression. As now we have a market for our goods, our companies can hire more people, we're selling stuff to foreign countries. It's a big shift. And it's not just this. FDR does a couple other things that are worth noting to help get us prepared, so to speak, for the war. We have these Neutrality Acts, which are designed to keep us out, ideally by their name, to keep us neutral. This Cash and Carry Act is a shift, which allows us to trade militarily with other countries as long as they pay cash and take it home themselves. But there's two things that also happened in 1940 at FDR's direction, which begins to get the country more ready for war, despite the fact the country still wants us to stay out of it. The first is the Selective Service Act of 1940. This is the first ever peacetime draft in American history. We're starting to register and draft people into the military, despite the fact that we're not at war with anybody. And the second piece is this destroyer for bases deal. Great Britain is struggling to keep their ships above water, so the U.S. trades a bunch of old Navy ships that we don't want anymore, a bunch of old destroyers, gives them to Great Britain. In exchange, we get back a few military bases that are in the Atlantic and also a couple in the Pacific. So in this way, FDR can kind of go around Congress because he's not selling anything. It's more of a trade of stuff that was old. Congress gets on board and approves. So go ahead and take a minute with your partner, though, and take a look at that cartoon. It's a good cartoon. What is that cartoon trying to get at, trying to prove, trying to say about U.S. neutrality? Take 1 minute with your partner and identify for me, what is that cartoon trying to say about U.S. neutrality? Go. Go. Go.
Neutrality Act was just to like let the
Good job. Good job.
I'm sorry, Stan. I'm sorry. But yeah, the neutrality doesn't want to let any of the U.S. ships not go ahead and give out
It's on the board program.
relating to other periods.
The draft. First ever peacetime draft in American history.
Congress. You can say that. Those are all.
Where's good?
Windshield. Is everybody in Congress old?
All right. So, talk to me, please. Santos, dive into this cartoon for us, please, kid.
So there's a little ship right there.
Yeah, there is. You're right.
Aid.
Uh-huh.
Maybe Britain.
What does the ship represent, do you think?
Aid. Like in the form of arms, maybe.
Okay, cool. Cool.
Oh, and food.
Okay, arms and food. Arms could be
yeah,
food
that's
if
gonna
they can.
kill
Okay.
you. That's gonna kill U.S. neutrality.
How is it going to kill U.S. neutrality?
That little thingy's gonna burn the beard, and well, U.S. neutrality is gonna end because of its aid.
Okay. Then if this ship keeps moving forward, what's going to happen? It's going to drag him off of his tree into the water. Yes? If this ship keeps going and keeps pulling, then it's going to pull the U.S. in to the war. Yes, sir.
I took it as the Neutrality Act is stopping the war from ending here because it said aid don't win.
Maybe. But maybe us sending aid we think is going to win. Us sending aid is going to drag us into the war. It can go either way, though. Both things are fundamentally true according to Dr. Seuss. Cool? So in 1940, FDR runs for a third term as president. For the first time, somebody finally violates this Washingtonian precedent. It's not a law. It is now. It's not a law, though. And FDR runs for a third term by basically saying, America, we're in a crisis. We're at a crossroads. And if we change leadership now, it will not be good. He runs on a platform of neutrality, but preparedness. Literally the exact same platform that Wilson ran on in 1916. Wilson says, I kept us out of the war, but let's get a little more prepared. FDR says, I want to stay out of the war, but let's get more prepared. The exact same fundamental platform as what we saw Wilson run on in 1916. Neutrality, but preparedness. And look at our election map. How does he do? Yeah, where does he lose? In the Midwest, in these places that are more isolationist, who think he's already done too much to get us close to the war. So the Midwest is where he loses some support. He does not do as good as he did in 1936. He does not do as good as he did in 1932. but he still wins a pretty strong amount of the popular vote, and he kills it in Electoral College. He just loses some states that he had won in 1936. It's a great cartoon. You ever play those like fair games? You can like throw and like knock over multiple things. Yes. All right. He's at the fair. He knocked over Hoover in 28, Landon in 32, and now he's coming for Wilkie. The guy he's running against. But who's on Wilkie's shoulders?
Washington.
Yeah, George Washington saying no third term. So now he's running against Wilkie and Washington, the Washington legacy of 2 terms. Pretty good. And he prepares for possible entry to the war by calling for this first ever peacetime draft of the Selective Service Act of 1940. Now, by 1940, this is an important piece. America still wants to stay neutral military-wise. We don't want to get into the war. But most Americans are totally okay with supporting the Allies, realizing those are the good guys. So by 1940, it's not that the U.S. wants to enter the war, it's that most Americans have no problem supporting the war. Big turning point. 1940, Congress appropriates or spends $10 billion for military preparedness. That's a big shift. Now we're spending more money to prepare. We have our first peacetime draft, and FDR is elected to his 3rd term. But right after FDR is elected, things kind of escalate pretty quickly. Things escalate quickly because France goes in Francis. France is invaded in early 1940, and France falls incredibly quickly. Now FDR knows all this is going to happen. He's paying good attention. And he's thinking, I just took, as you guys know from last semester, like an 18-week class on World War II. So I know more than I used to. FDR knows France is going to fall eventually, and by then, the only country left who's a good guy in Europe is who? Just the British, right? So FDR knows at some point the U.S. is going to have to get involved. FDR thinks the French, though, can hold out for at least probably close to 2 years. The French instead make it about 2 minutes. The French have the biggest military in Europe. The French are heavily defended right here on their border with Germany. And instead the Germans just go around and roll right through France, and France gives up like that. So it's like, oh crap. We thought we had a year and a half, maybe 2 years for us to be needed in Europe, and now we're needed yesterday. Good job, France. So the fall of France in 1940 worry Americans because now, as of early 1940, nobody's left but Britain. Nobody's left. The Germans begin what's called the Battle of Britain. Hopefully Mr. Montes did his job and taught you about it last year. But it's a constant air barrage above London and other huge British cities. Night after night after night after night. The German Luftwaffe attacks British... Huh? Freaking Germans. And now, more than ever, we need to prop up Britain. Because if we don't prop up Britain, like, Europe's done. Like that. Here's some examples of Britain in the days during the Battle of Britain. There are the British people sleeping in subway tunnels. Night after night after night after night to avoid the air attacks. My boy Winston Churchill. I love Churchill. Churchill's a G. Churchill's like a top 3 non-American born historical figure for me. In my opinion, I think he's phenomenal. But nobody's left. All that's left is England, and England can't afford cash and carry anymore. They have no ships to carry stuff, and they have no cash. So in 1940, things change a little bit. And then we start changing with this important speech, which should sound familiar, the Arsenal of Democracy. You remember that video clip at the very beginning of the year? When Adam Sandler in SNL was like, what did FDR mean when he said he wanted to be the Arsenal of Democracy? And all the kids were like, I think I showed you guys like the second week of school.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's the speech he's referencing in that video clip. And that one girl raises her hand, and he's like, "Oh, cool, I got to volunteer." And she's like, "Who came up with that name? Yoga, right? Teacher life." So, I was gonna have you read this, but I figured maybe you could listen to it instead. I was feeling generous.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So, I know. So. This is good, though, because it demonstrates another important piece that I haven't talked much about FDR's presidency, and that's his communication with the people. So FDR